almost just printed it out and brought it to you today. Anyway, we're on the air. Here we are, continuing our discussion of interpersonal communication, Chapter 6, looking specifically at the dimensions of relationships, qualitative dimensions of relationships, how we create, manage, and sometimes dissolve relationships. We'll get to the dissolution part of the relationship today. Some of you will find this to be fairly typical of situations in which you found yourself, whether those relationships are romantic or even familial relationships within families. And family relationships can deteriorate. I don't want to dwell on the sadder parts of life, but we know that sometimes we get stuck with relatives that we don't necessarily like, that we have relationships with that we don't particularly find fruitful or positive or rewarding, and so that's a possibility. Prior to getting there, we want to lay some additional foundation. And if I can get the slide up on the screen, this is the most botched up slide, and at the last minute I almost decided to print something out and then I didn't. Let's see what we can do with this. I'm under the impression that sooner or later all of the slides will be revised and put up. I hope so. I'm not sure what later means. Certainly worry about sooner. Anyway, where we're going, I in my notes had this identified as Theory 4, just as a way of sort of keeping you tracking what I thought to be theories, and as much as anything for purposes of your essays, more than anything to do with preparing for the examination. There are a couple of competing views of what we're going to talk about today. The original work was called Discrepancy Arousal Theory, and some of the earliest work was done looking at relationship development between parents and children, or between adult caregivers and children. Could be teachers, could be daycare people, etc., etc. One of the assumptions in discrepancy arousal theory is that each of us has expectations about how others are supposed to behave in specific kinds of situations. And I suspect if we pause just a little bit and think about that, most of you would agree that makes a lot of sense. Sort of flipping it around, one of the themes that we develop is that part of the socialization that people go through as they acquire communication skills, develop and execute communication plans, is the management of impressions, And one of the ways to look at this is to sort of, in a very general sense, characterize ourselves as characters in an undirected play. We've talked about that before, that we are figures, we are perhaps even stereotypes. And we're enacting a certain kind of set of scripts and nonverbal behaviors as a way of telling the world, if you would, perhaps one person at a time, who we are. Some of this also becomes very relevant to where we're going in the last set of units for the third exam, and that's organizational communication. If you get ready to go for a job interview, for instance, do you think about how you're going to manage the impression that the interviewer gets of you, which you hope is highly positive and therefore leads to a job? I would guess that most of you would say, yeah, that makes sense. That's pretty much how I would think about it. We even have books entitled Dress for Success and all of that sort of thing. Which means then that we walk around in our life with the notion that there are expectations that others have of us, and therefore we know that we should behave in certain ways if we're going to be seen as positive. Now, discrepancy arousal theory argues, in a sense then, that if a parent or other caregiver of children engages in communication with children, that there are expectations as to how the child should behave. And to the extent that the child behaves in a, we could say, positive way, meeting the expectations, the relationship then is likely to experience convergence. This word convergence and its counterpart, divergence, becomes increasingly important to us over time. And I think you'll see why. Because if I behave in a way where I'm seen as being a friendly type, as being a cordial type, as a polite type, as easy to communicate with, as a trustful individual, and so forth, that should lead you to see me in a positive way, right? And if I behave in ways that you see as rude, as uncooperative, as having a completely different set of attitudes than you would prefer, you may then say, well, I'm experiencing divergence. I feel myself getting further from this person rather than closer together. And most of you know that friendship is this sense of feeling closeness as opposed to distance with your interaction with other people. And it doesn't make any difference necessarily how close we are in physical proximity, but it has to do with something that we can easily call mental proximity. I feel that I am like you. There are even movies, and now it reminds me, and I never know the name of these movies, but there's a movie out there with Gwyneth Paltrow, I believe, who somehow discovers that somebody that she's researching is some sort of an ancestor of hers. And she begins to feel this affinity. Well, affinity becomes important to us, doesn't it? Affinity is this feeling of growing together, coming to like one another, as opposed to the opposite. Now, the assumption that we make in discrepancy arousal is that if the child acts in ways that we would find violating our expectation of what the child should do, then the parent may be less willing to do whatever the invitation might have been. Let's translate that into real life. Let's imagine that we say to a child, hey, do you want to go outside and play? And the child says, yeah, whatever. Do you then see that as the positive, oh boy, am I excited, I want to go out and play? That you would have needed to say, I think that this is what would please the child, and therefore I will do what pleases the child because the child met my expectation of the kind of reaction that I would predict. At the very basic level of children, you see, we begin to make these sorts of estimations. If the child doesn't seem excited, we are then less likely to feel the convergence. I want to take my time and effort to do this with the child because it's almost as though the child doesn't care. Now, when we get to be adolescents, we have fine-tuned this to the nth degree so that if our parents say, do you want to do something, we immediately create maximum divergence, saying not within our lifetime and certainly not with you because you are my parents. Isn't that one of the sort of straining elements that is characteristic of adolescence, trying to distance ourselves? And to do that, we actually at times go out of our way to violate what we would think to be the expectations that our parents would have. Our parents take us somewhere. They're doing something nice, and they say, well, are you having a good time? And the adolescent looks and says, whatever. You see what I'm getting at? These kinds of comments can increase convergence, coming together, feeling warmth, feeling some sort of shared personal regard, divergence, coming further apart, moving away from one another. So in the theory called discrepancy arousal, we in a sense then have a failure to comply, whether it's either a willingness or an inability, a failure to comply with the expectation of the other person, which leads to a negative arousal, as opposed to the willingness and ability to comply, which leads to a positive response. You see what we're getting at? Because what we're trying to do is to see the extent to which what we're doing is matched in a positive way by the other interactant here. Yeah. I will do my very best. Where would you like for me to begin repeating all of that? It's about the beginning where I said this is Comm theory?
I got failure to
Failure to comply with the expectation leads to a negative arousal, can lead to divergence, huh? If you say to a good friend, let's go do something, and your friend reacts in a fairly neutral or even potentially negative way, what's your likelihood? You might up the ante a little bit. You might try to get the person more motivated to do that. But all of a sudden you begin to feel, well, he doesn't want to do that or she doesn't want to do that, so maybe I ought to do something else. If they do that long enough, it may be that you then say no reason to have this person as a friend, right? Conversely, there is the notion of a positive meeting of the expectation, and you say, well, that's what I like. And isn't that typical of friendship when you call somebody and say, hey, let's go do something, and they say, yeah, that sounds good. Okay. See, there's convergence. And if every time you call them, they say, no, I don't want to go, and particularly with you, after a while, that's probably not going to be healthy for the relationship, right? You see what I'm getting at? All right, now, let's imagine that we have people that test this hypothesis and they suggest that it may not entirely be true. But first of all, we say there's got to be arousal, negative or positive. We usually think of arousal in this case as a negative response. There's got to be reciprocation, meaning I go back and forth, and or some compensation. Now the compensation can be something rather interesting in this regard because it sort of opens the door to a group of researchers at the University of Arizona that said, if interpersonal communication is reward-oriented, in what ways can we overlook discrepancy if we think the reward is sufficient? I don't know whether that makes sense or not, but we'll see if we can explain that. I always use dogs to explain that. It seems to me that dogs explain it rather nicely. Most of us like dogs. Some of you adore dogs. But isn't it true that dogs don't always do what we want? Either they're entirely too affectionate, and so we get ready to go somewhere and our stupid dog is jumping up and down on us or on something else. Or this dog is so stressed by our being gone that the dog decides to eat our very best pair of shoes to show us how distressed the dog is, which is the dog's way of saying how much the dog loves you. But you get home and you say, stupid dog, why did you eat my shoes? But I love you, my stupid dog, nevertheless. And it's this I love you nevertheless, meaning that the presence of the dog is more rewarding than the arousal, the discrepancy. The reward is greater than the discrepancy. Meaning that if we believe that the long-term quality of the relationship is sufficient, we tend to want to overcome, overlook, dismiss, discount the negative arousal on the prospect that something in the way of reward is even greater. For instance, can we overlook certain flaws in somebody that we like because our liking of them is a stronger factor in the relationship than our being upset with their flaws? Do you see what I'm getting at? Now let's imagine that we put this to a test. Some of you say, that's the kind of study I would like to be a part of. Where do I sign up? Let's send out 3 different teams. And each team will get an opportunity to do some buying. Go to a shopping mall, go into a store. And person 1 is the buyer, person 2 is the observer. Now, Group A, Pair A, go in, and Buyer A tries to stand way too close. That's a violation, isn't it? Ask way too many questions, take an enormous amount of the salesperson's time, and show absolutely no sign of buying anything. And after that person leaves, the cohort, the friend says, it was interesting to watch that person's behavior. What do you think of that person? That person stood too close to you at times, asked an enormous amount of questions, took your time, and then seemed to me never was interested in buying. So what would the salesperson likely say about the individual? Terribly rude? A real nuisance? I hate to see people like that come into my store. Some of you are now beginning to nod your head. In retail sales, you've seen people like this before. Once, when I had a chance to be in retail sales, that's a long story, I don't have time to tell. There were a couple that showed up. We were in the furniture department, and when they showed up, all of the professional salespeople left. They were rude, they never bought, they were annoyance, and they would always say to me, because I was the stupid underling, you go take care of them. All right, they were just abusive. I couldn't believe that two people would go out of their way to make other people's lives so miserable. I wondered what their life was like. Yes.
I said something today.
You bet you can.
It's like I love people, but like working in retail made me hate people and like getting into conversation.
It's because they violate your expectations, right? Yeah.
As much as being nice to them, they're trying to be as much as they can mean to you.
Okay.
That relationship, I just don't understand.
So now I will give the rest of this sermon to you. All right. Now we've got pair B showing up. Pair B, person does the same sorts of things, takes a lot of time, stands way too close and does things that are a violation, nonverbal communication, asks lots of questions, but continually talks about an interest in buying, that I'm shopping and I will shortly be back, maybe, kind of, could be, to purchase. That person leaves, the other person says then, what did you think of that person? Team C shows up. Team C at the end, literally waving a credit card in the air. The buyer is. The buyer says, I've now looked at 3 or 4 other stores and I know that you are really the place that I want to buy. They've done the same thing, stood too close, asked too many questions, take too much time. I got to go and double check that this is exactly what I want, but I'm going to come back in just a few minutes and I'm going to seal the deal. The cohort shows up and asks, what kind of person did you think that person was? Now, what would you say in each of those 3 situations when, as far as you know, the innocent victim of this study, the only difference was the apparent amount or likelihood of a reward for these transgressions? Which of these people would you have seen in the more positive or least negative light? Buyer A, buyer B, buyer C. You bet. That's exactly how the study turned out.
I think that all customers are just as likely to be looked down upon, no matter whether they buy something or not.
But it's a continuous variable, is it?
To a point.
Well, it's not a binary variable, I don't think. I don't know that all customers, here's a person that said at one point she actually liked customers, right? Yeah. Now you don't, right? I guess it is binary then, right? But I think that if you are in a situation like that and you think that you're going to get some reward for all of this rudeness, does that make you less willing to dislike the buyer or not? Yeah.
It kind of makes the fall harder when they don't come back.
That's another part of it, yes. That's why if you go back and interview C may ultimately be the most disappointed to find out that this was a university research study and there is no sale, right? Because they really thought that they had something that justified dealing with this rudeness. You're absolutely, that's another reason why within a relationship, if one person in a kind of manipulative way says that I'm really worth it, then when they come back and demonstrate that they're not, the problem can be that a reaction, the amount of arousal is actually greater. Is that likely? Is actually greater. You know, I had a friend that I didn't like very much, but I didn't expect much out of them. I had another friend that I liked a lot and expected a lot out of them, and they really let me down. Which of those two is the greatest fall? Right? Yeah, I would agree with you, because I think that the argument that runs throughout all of this is that in the development of relationships, we're trying to maximize rewards and eliminate costs, and that's the whole notion of social exchange theory, et cetera, so that in a sense we're trying to manage this. We're trying to codefine and negotiate control, trust, and intimacy. All of these are dimensions that we use to assess sort of where we are. Well, in that case then, we can encounter conflict. Now, our first question we might raise is conflict the sign of an inherently bad relationship? Is conflict the sign of an inherently bad relationship? You shake your head no. Tell me more, but push the button when you do so.
I think everybody has like conflicts in the relationship, just how you work it out.
Just how you work it out.
I mean,
whether you work it out in a positive way or a negative way. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what the theory suggests. If you have a relationship that cannot tolerate conflict, is it a good relationship? Is it a strong relationship? One would argue not. A relationship has to be a place where differences can be identified, negotiated, and solved. Is that fair? And if there is nothing to the relationship, or if one person constantly gives in to the other, aren't we now back to the issue of control and dominance as an example? And if the person who is being controlled and dominated decides to change and to exert herself or himself, and the other person doesn't reciprocate, now we got a real problem. Because the old modes of dealing with conflict no longer are operable. So conflict is not an inherently harmful element of a relationship, and it actually can strengthen relationships if constructive rather than destructive resolution strategies and styles are used. Well, let's look a little bit more at that, and let's see what goes on. Theory of conflict can result from weak communication skills. It can harm or strain our communication skills. Children often resort to a win-lose fight kind of mode because they don't know how to resolve conflict in a more agreeable way, we could say. My grandson, as perfect and precious as he is 2 years older than his little sister. One's 4, one's 2. One's bigger, one's stronger, one's faster. And so most of the conflict is resolved by big brother taking things from little sister. Not necessarily a healthy relationship, because someday little sister may grow up to be big enough to take on big brother. I have a family, one of my wife's brothers, our sister-in-law, has 4 children. The oldest is a girl. Then there are 2 middle brothers, and then there was the baby sister. And the baby sister was always picked on, and people in that family, the boys, would call her baby. Well, baby is now 6'2". And baby is a really good soccer player, and it's not at all unlikely that baby could whip one or both of the brothers at the same time. So the tables have turned. And now there's a greater amount of respect. But probably either of the brothers would have defended baby just so they could pick on her again, right? We see these in sibling relationships as much as anything else. Typically we think of as conflict as growing out of the need to deal with a scarcity of choices or positions. Meaning that if we were to say at the next Olympics, everybody that competes gets a gold medal, would there be a very substantial interest in the Olympics? Isn't the whole notion that one person or one team gets the gold, gets the silver, gets the bronze, and the rest of them just go home? They just got to participate. Scarcity leads to conflict. If we have an ample number of Oreo cookies in the house, there is no scarcity. The scarcity sets in when we're down to the last one or two or three. And how we deal with the Oreo cookies then begins to be important to us, because we can sneak the Oreo cookies and hide them so that nobody knows where they are. We win, they lose. We can get into a fight over the Oreo cookies, and I hate to be too anecdotal about your life experience, and in the fighting over the Oreo cookies, they get busted up so that if you want them, you have to get down on the floor and lick them up. And even if we're down to the last Oreo cookie, you can divide it by breaking it apart so that there is a chocolate part for each person, and then you can take a knife and carefully divide the icing so that each person gets half. And in my family, the argument was the first person gets to cut and the next person gets to choose. That's a way of bringing honesty into the cutting. And my sister and I would get down on the floor, for instance, and measure things that we had to divide, like a glass of something, a bottle of something, and we would take hours to get it just right so that it was even, so that this mean older sister of mine couldn't pick on this poor, wonderful, innocent little brother. There were rules, you see. One of the ways of looking at it is dealing with this scarcity, which provokes conflict, and then we look at the ways in which we resolve the conflict. Well, the other element of the conflict is the extent to which we care about the conflict. To which we care about the conflict. All of these reality dramas out there, would the conflict be as good if there wasn't some kind of substantial monetary reward? $1 million. $1 million. There was a piece in the Chronicle either yesterday or today about some $12,000 a year rodeo cowboy from Belleville that is being palmed off as an $80 million. Strange that we can get into such a level of deception just for entertainment purposes, huh? Joe Bachelor or whatever he is out there. Anyway, the notion is that if you up the ante, I care more, I'm going to work harder to influence the outcome of this decision. So how do we do that? Let's talk about modes of conflict resolution. And if the world were right, we would have a slide that would have the following words on it. One of those would be avoiding. Avoiding simply means that we leave the conflict or we don't engage in conflict. We avoid it. Parents often do that with children that are in a fight, in conflict. You will go to your room. Time out. Now, avoiding can actually help to resolve a conflict, because one of the things that can occur during a conflict is that we get increased levels of adrenaline. Ever been in a conflict and find yourself all emotional, all worked up, and 3 days later you can't imagine why you had that feeling? It was a physiological reaction, which is very normal. And one of the things that avoiding can do is that we have a chance to cool down. We actually even have that as a matter of public policy in terms of labor disputes. We call it a cooling down period, where we don't let people talk for a while so that they literally just calm down. But avoiding can often be a real problem in a relationship, though, because I avoided conflict for 15 years, and when I finally decided to fight back, I will really fight back, because now I've got all of this involvement built up inside of me. Okay. Secondly, accommodation, smoothing. I can respond to a conflict by trying to put as much positive feeling into winning as I possibly can. Parents will often do that. Don't pick on that person. That person is your brother or sister. All right? We put a positive emotional tone. Some of you say, well, let's just stop and have a beer if we're in an argument. That may or may not help. And it's kind of like maybe avoiding, but it's trying to do something or think positively rather than get into this downward spiral. Because what can happen in conflict is we can go for a win-win outcome where both parties win as much as can be given the nature of the resources that are available. We can have a win-lose, which is the product of competition, which will be the third of the conflict resolution styles I will talk about. Or we can have a lose-lose outcome. A lose-lose outcome. One of the ways in which we look at various crises in various parts of the world is that both sides get into a lose-lose outcome. People have said that is what went on and maybe still goes on in Northern Ireland. People say that's what's going on in Israel with the Palestinians on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That until they get to the point where they have lose-lose, loss-loss, down to the point they just get miserable, they won't decide to opt for a more positive resolution. A more positive resolution. So we've gone all the way from interpersonal communication to international politics using exactly the same kind of model. I mentioned that third mode. There are 5 altogether. It's competition. Competition typically works on the assumption that I want to compete in the distribution of resources so that I get more and you get less. Competition can actually increase the conflict rather than decrease the conflict. Fourth, compromise. Compromise assumes that people give something to get something. An exchange, a division of the resources. I've got to give something to get something. I'm trying to maximize wins for both and minimize losses for both. The fifth kind is collaborative decision making. And one of the interesting aspects of collaborative decision making is that it literally asks people to think outside of the box and to try to come up with a more creative solution or to see the conflict as a mutually shared problem that both parties need to solve rather than simply a fight over the resources. Collaborative decision making would be the fifth. It's arguably the best because instead of simply seeking to win and lose, it looks at creative ways to solve a mutually shared problem. So the argument is, if we can kind of wrap up the notion of conflict, that conflict can be a positive aspect of a relationship, that relationships can be strengthened by conflict, and a relationship that cannot tolerate conflict is likely to be pretty frail, pretty fragile. There are dimensions that lead to conflict and predict its occurrence. There are ways in which we can work together to solve the conflict, each of them being in various ways more likely to be constructive. Leading us then, in conclusion, I'll get to you in just a second, leading us then in conclusion to prefer integrative solutions where we work together rather than distributive solutions. Integrative solutions rather than distributive solutions to conflict. Okay, question? The third, I believe, was compromise. I'm sorry, competition. Collaborative decision making.
You said looks at creative ways to do it.
To solve a mutually shared problem. To see the conflict as a mutually shared problem rather than simply, in a more narrow sense, the distribution of this particular resource or choice. So that instead of fighting over the last Oreo, we might decide to get the car keys and go out and get us a whole new bag of Oreos. Right?
You said that competition usually leads to more conflict.
It can, because one side wants to win, denying the other side.
How would it lead to resolution then?
How will it lead to resolution? It might mean that it forces people to adopt one of the other modes. In counterbalance, often competition precedes compromise. It could lead to a resolution by one side winning and the other side losing. We see that in athletic events and other kinds of contests, right? And in a sense, the resolution is simply the decision that somebody else renders. Court case could be that sort of thing. Court case is typically looked upon as being a competition rather than collaborative decision making. But court cases can indeed move into collaborative decision making or even into compromise. But a lot of times we think of a court case as one side wins and the other side loses. We even at various times in legal settings bring in mediation and negotiation as an alternative. We know, and we'll talk later on about relationship dissolution, that in people's lives one of the most unhappy moments of their life is having to fight in a divorce situation over certain things. In divorce, we tend to fight over three things. We fight over the children, we fight over the dogs, and if you're from Green Bay, Wisconsin, you fight over the Green Bay tickets. It's legendary, true story that the Green Bay tickets are so important to people that they will fight over who gets the Green Bay tickets. And what's worse is, it isn't, well, I'll take one ticket and you take a ticket because I don't want to be sitting next to this person. Do you see what I'm getting at? So there we go. Legendary battles over the Green Bay tickets. It is one of the few teams, I guess, that is really truly owned by people within the community. Maybe it is the only team that is owned by people in the community. So that you spend a lifetime getting those 50-yard line tickets. You pass it down. You hope you only have 2 children and neither of them marry. You see what I'm getting at? Yes, okay, there we are. Conflict. Any last questions? Moving on. Affinity. We want to, yes?
Just quickly, your last point in conflict resolution was integrative versus...
distributive. Okay? Theory of affinity. Let me flip the screen and go to that. Coming to like and be liked is a product of events, conditions, goals, and interaction styles. In one sense, we don't have to tell ourselves that. We just remind ourselves of that, right? Coming to like and be liked is a product of events. Certain things occur. One of the things that's interesting is that we often, although we sometimes build this into dramatizations, don't we? Over the weekend, I saw part of the movie where Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan are in the book business. What's the name of that movie? You've Got Mail. And by sheer circumstance, they hate each other, and by sheer circumstance, they come to fall in love, right? Events. There's some silly movie out there where somebody 20 years later decides to go back to town and find the person that they're supposed to marry right in the midst of getting married to somebody else, etc. We like this notion of events. A lot of our life is surely the matter of coincidence. I was there, you were there, we became friends, etc., etc. Or we became friends because we shared something. I have groups, for instance, in one of the classes that I teach, and if they like one another, I've got people out there that 10 or 15 years later still get together once a month as friends working in Houston because they liked one another in that group. Sheer events can create what's going on. Various kinds of conditions can affect the increased potentiality of liking in the development of affinity. Certain conditions. I'm lonely, you're lonely, we get on the internet, we find one another, whatever it might be. We sometimes have to put ourselves into various kinds of events because of the conditions that we find ourselves in life. We're looking for something. A person's been married for a number of years, one of the spouses dies. The whole notion then of affinity creation begins to change, and that can even strain relationships within the family where the children don't like this new person that mom or dad has discovered out there in the world. One of the other arguments or elements of affinity is that affinity is goal-driven behavior. Goal-driven behavior. I have to kind of want to like you and be liked by you for the relationship to have much prospect, because I have to do certain things. I have to be in a certain way. I have to talk in a certain way. I have to have plans. I have to, do all of these kinds of things. And finally, we come down to interaction styles. And some of you still like this notion of smoothness and ease of interaction, but we know that that often is the way in which we find affinity, is that we do have interaction styles that are compatible rather than incompatible, and we've already talked about that a little bit in terms of discrepancy arousal. And that is, to what extent can we engage in relationship development given our ability, our interaction styles. When we look later on and we ask ourselves, why do adolescents consume media content that they do, a lot of that has to do with interaction styles, making oneself interesting and attractive and building friendships and romantic relationships. Some antecedent effects, or some effects leading to affinity, antecedent effects. What has gone on in the past? What has gone on in the past in a set of events? Constraints and characteristics. Affinity sometimes has to overcome certain kinds of constraints. One of those constraints can be distance. One of those can be the characteristics of the relationship. Strategic activity, what does one person do? Responses by others, what does the other person do? Is there a reciprocation of action and reaction leading to convergence, or does it somehow lead to divergence? So, there we are, thinking a little bit about affinity. Yeah.
The theory of affinity, the antecedent factors.
Antecedents, okay.
How does that tie into the theory?
Could be, for instance, sort of what has been a series of events leading up to this. I might have known something about you before I ever met you. I might be living in one town and I might move to a town where you are. You and I might be passing in some way in a airport and wherever it might be, and we discover that we have things that we like to talk about together. We create some sort of a friendship. It may literally dissolve at the point you get on your plane, I get on my plane, but for some period of time we enjoyed some interaction. Some of the antecedent events might have something to do with what you've experienced relevant to what I've experienced. You see what I'm getting at? That can become a part of the conversational foundation.
What would you say about the constraints?
Constraints can be the restrictions against the relationship happening. Do people work against one another in terms of the creation of relationships? Do people work against one another? Do parents sometimes do that? Don't like this person, don't associate with that person for a variety of reasons, whatever they might be. I was in New Zealand several years ago, in Australia several years ago, and one of the things that they were doing was trying to create interactive CDs that children could use to deal with a variety of issues on friendship development. And they had episodes there of two little girls who had become good friends, and one of them was a Jew and one of them was a Muslim, and their parents were dead set against the two children having anything to do with one another. And they told the story of how they had worked out a friendship because they honestly liked each other. But they had to do so in ways that kept the parents from finding this out, because the parents would bring various sanctions or constraints down on the relationship. Right? So we can see that sort of thing. We can see constraints such as distance, constraints such as age, constraints such as a lot of other things. So there can be all of these conditions that can work against as and also for the development of affinity. And affinity is essentially just this notion of liking and being liked. Right? Okay? Let's talk about relationship dissolution. One of the reasons that a relationship dissolves, perhaps the only reason, is that it seems to take more cost than is acquired in reward. For instance, if a friend and you meet in college and go on about the rest of your life after college, the person moves away, gets married, you get married, you have children, you have a job, you have a career, you have all of this, they have all of this. Is it possible that all of your daily activities are such that you then do not, over time, make the expenditure necessary to keep the relationship alive? Some of you are so tender in your age you haven't experienced a lot of that, but I will guarantee you that at my age I've seen what were once very close friendships sort of dissolve because they are expensive to keep alive beyond something like an occasional phone call and or an occasional seasonal greeting card. And I even forgot my sister's birthday the other day. She told me when I called her, once a month we make the deal. I call you, you call me, right? Why don't I call her every night? Some of you do say, oh, I would call my sister every night. Okay, that's fine. Some of you say, I'd never call my sister, never want to call my sister. Well, isn't this sort of what we're talking about, is that relationships grow, they change, they're maintained, and sometimes they dissolve. And the argument is that what we're getting out of the relationship, whatever it is not worth the cost that it takes to keep it alive. Some of you say, well, it must not have been a very good relationship in the beginning. Well, that's okay. That fits the model, meaning that on a scale of 1 to 7, 1 to 9, it was somewhere in the middle, wasn't very strong, therefore there wasn't enough reward to keep it motivated to stay alive beyond passing comments. There was a piece in the paper the other day, I think it may have been in the Newsweek, you know, in that part of the Newsweek where people have those little personal reflections. It may have been a person writing in there saying that she was embarrassed to go back to her college reunion, and somebody approached her who she did not remember and said, don't you remember me? We were the very best of friends. She didn't even remember her. Couldn't have picked her out of a lineup. And yet the other person shows up and says, we were the best of friends. She said, how can that happen in life? Well, you got a lot of other things on your mind. Your time is precious, and how you allot that time is strategic and has something to do with relationships. Relationship maintenance, the theory argues, costs effort, and does so because it is designed to achieve rewards. And we spend the more time where we need to based upon the rewards that we are seeking. Well then, once relationships are thought to cost more than they are worth, they tend to decay naturally or strategically. Now, naturally means that we just drift apart. Nice metaphor. Have you ever thought, I do, about how much of our language is designed to talk about relationships and other communication events? Without us ever really knowing it, we drifted apart. As opposed to, we had the biggest fight and both decided that was it, never to see one another again. That's strategic. Now, one of the pieces that I carefully have dug out and prepared for you is how to dump a guy in 10 days, or whatever the name of the movie is, which may someday be up on WebCT, but you're probably better off going to Blockbuster and renting it. The woman wanted to demonstrate what it is in terms of dating behavior that some women do that drive men away, and she set out to drive this guy away. He unfortunately had made a bet that in so many days he would get her to fall in love with him. And then the plot gets more complicated and goes on and on and on. But what she did, in my mind, looking at this, thinking of you looking at it and appreciating the theory that we're talking about, was that she kept doing things that were on the negative side of the relationship, costs rather than rewards. And he, of course, overlooked those. Remember the theory we talked about a while ago, because he thought the reward was greater than the cost. The reward earlier was simply winning the bet, and then, of course, as all of life goes, he fell in love with her. And if it hadn't been for that, then this whole thing would have been really stupid, right? And then at the end, we as viewers say, well, they should have fallen in love, and they should end up happily ever after, because we like those stories, because they don't ever happen in real life. No, I'm just teasing. Right? Okay, once relationships are thought to cost more than they are worth, they tend to decay naturally or strategically. Then they are motivated by cost. We've established that. Requires some mutuality of dissolution strategies and goals. Now, as kids, we probably tried to get rid of other kids. I hate to get too autobiographical in here, but I would find it surprising if somewhere along the line, you and some of your other friends didn't actively conspire to get rid of certain friends. I don't mean in a physical sense. You bumped them off. This is not the Sopranos at work here, right? But you might have told them that you were going to go somewhere and you went somewhere else, or you called them really terrible names. We sometimes do this to siblings, or we do it to people who are younger than we are, or whatever it might be. Now, there's some literature out there that says that boys do this less than girls. Girls are infinitely meaner spirited in fighting as adolescents, and even sometimes pre-adolescents, over friendships, and some women come away feeling enormously scarred and betrayed by this, which apparently is a gender-based thing, because men rarely have those same kinds of feelings in proportion to what women report. There's a fair amount of literature that has evolved over that over the last number of years. Partly because guys see relationship and relationship development differently. Women socialized early on to see relationships as a very important part of their life. Therefore, there's a power component to it, a control component. And the persons that can control the most relationships in a school setting, for instance, turn out to be the most popular, the most powerful, the most this, that, and the other thing. Results can be the dissolution can be the result of cost and can be achieved by cost. Later on, we're going to talk about testing friendships, and one of the ways in which I can test a friendship is to put you to endurance. If you really like me, you will do whatever I want you to do, no matter how absolutely painful it is. And I'm testing the quality of my relationship. Do you, for instance, find yourself trying to be less available to somebody in perhaps a romantic relationship on the assumption that if they like me enough, they'll fight hard to find me and to get back together again, and if they don't, then I guess it wasn't much anyway, right? So we deal with this issue of cost. One of the arguments is that relationship dissolution then goes through a series of stages, and I've got these stages at the bottom of my transparent, or my slide there, PowerPoint slide. The intrapsychic, I love these words, these are terrific words. The theorists did a good job of coming up with words that not only have descriptive potency, but real interest value. Intrapsychic, meaning that I think about the cost of my relationship. Is it worth it to me? Is it worth it to me? I put a lot into this, I get nothing back. The first step is we have to be thoughtful about it. Secondly, and there's an argument which comes first of the middle two, and arguably they could be interchanged in a given situation. But sooner or later, I and that other person are likely to talk about it. You cost too much, you're not worth it. Now, we don't use words like that, do we? But I put a lot into this relationship, and you give me very little back. That's a way in which we talk about it. I'm true to you, and you are as faithless to me as a human being can be. I confront you with evidence. I do all of this kind of stuff. You're unreliable, you're unpredictable, you're unworthy, you're all of these uns. Now, what do you have to say for yourself? Guilty? All right. Right? No, you may fight back and say, well, you misunderstand me. We often do that, don't we? I really like you more than I give the impression of, and I will change. I will change. Women work on the assumption they can change men. Men work on the assumption that they're beyond change. Either one, they're perfect, or they're hopeless. And I will not account for any one man's behavior in here on either of those two ends of the continuum. My wife, 38 years later, still sees me as a project. She made a comment. We went to a nice little evening out the other night that one of the women there treats her husband as a Ken doll. I thought that was interesting. I would never have thought of that. She gets to dress him. She said, look at that, Levi's and his little white t-shirt, and his sports coat. I never thought of him as a Ken doll. I mean, he's a former HPD guy. He's, gets out there, is retired now. He does all of this kind of things that I see. I never thought of him as a Ken doll, but maybe he is. And maybe the real telling point was that she gets to floof up his hair, right? She gets to even tease his hair. Well, now that's going a long way. My wife hasn't teased my hair in a long time, right? So what is my relationship? Am I on the brink of a meltdown here? We have one where this lopsided thing, high control, low control, not with an HPD officer. Anyway, the notion is we may talk in friendly ways or unfriendly ways, etc., dyad, between us and the other person. Social, which often is spelled quite different than what is on the screen. I just noticed that typo. Why is it you always notice typos just after you printed the transparency? It's been my experience in life. S-O-C-I-A-L, that should be. Social meaning that I talk to my other friends. Now, I may talk to my other friends before I talk to my partner, right? I may go to my very best friend, who may not be my partner. One of the assumptions that we make in life is that our romantic partner is our best friend. That doesn't always happen. I will tell you that. You probably know that you have lurking in the background over there somebody that is far more important to you than this romantic partner, and that I'm going to turn to my best friend. It could be your bartender. It could be your barber. It could be an innocent person just sitting on a bench somewhere. But you need to talk about it. I have a friend that has a problem with his or her girlfriend, husband, boyfriend, whatever. Yeah. Dyadic is talking to the other person. Social is talking to some person that's close to you in one way or another, perhaps insightful. Usually we want them to confirm what we think. Is that right? We certainly don't want them to disconfirm it. That's why we turn to somebody who is our really good friend. We know predictably they're going to take our side of the story. And is that going to be a biased or unbiased presentation of the facts in this court of human drama here? Am I likely to tell you the absolute truth? And I don't expect you to demand the absolute truth. Doesn't it infuriate you when you're blowing up about some romantic partner to your best friend, and your best friend wants to be accurate and honest in the interrogation? No, just agree with me. This is a louse. You're my friend. You're supposed to agree with me. You're not supposed to interrogate me. I didn't want to talk to my mother. I wanted to talk to you. My mother is trying to make things right. I want you to help me make things wrong. See, we strategically go about this looking to sort out, but not necessarily fairly and honestly. Now, we've gone through the social. The relationship is broken up. And I love this last one. Grave dressing. It's the funeral stories, folks. Now you might wonder, Dr. Heath, how many times in the history of the assignment that you talk about here have you had people deal with conflict resolution and or relationship dissolution? Oh yeah, it's happened, right? Yes. Why? Predictably, because you are obsessed at times with this at your time of life. That's why they have Friends as a television program. Friendships, relationships of all time. Grave dressing. It's the stories that we tell about how this all ended. One characteristic of those stories is blame placing, isn't it? Blame placing. I was married for a number of years, and I was absolutely a perfect partner. I was an angel in every way. I was totally giving. I was totally understanding. And unfortunately, I was married to an absolute louse that had no particular redeeming qualities. And it took me a long time to discover that, but when I did, I knew I had been right in disliking this person for all. That's a very biased report. At some point, you thought this person was pretty good, and now you're trying to come up with the facts that put you at ease. Or you maybe have this story, which was characteristic also of how to dump a guy in 10 days, and that was that several of the women could quite completely do the grave dressing thing by blaming themselves for all of what had gone wrong. And that was the whole motive for our heroine to be writing as she did. She wanted to tell women, yes, you're doing the wrong things, and here are some of the right things to do. So to what extent do we need to talk about a relationship? Have you ever dealt with somebody that is just out of a relationship, how obsessive they can be, how much it is on their mind, how they're trying to sort it out, and in one sense, putting it to rest through conversation so that the story ends? You may remember early on we talked about narrative theory. We live life as a narrative that accounts for our interest in news and sitcoms. Life is a narrative. We like some sense of story resolution. We like it to end. We don't like a story that just quits, do we? And sometimes we have to then bring the story to an end. We have to be able to describe the motives, the events, the circumstances, the character, and all of this so that the story has that sense of continuity. And so out of that, we then have the notion of relationships. Relationships can start, develop through affinity. They can encounter all kinds of conflict and costs. They can end. We ask ourselves, to what extent are we engaged in relationships like little accountants? Social exchange theory says that we calculate by norm compliance or not, whether a relationship is cost effective or cost inefficient. Disclosure becomes a part of this. Disclosure is something that we oblige ourselves to. If we're going to be a friend, we have to tell people more private information, because it is a way of giving them, if nothing else, insights into us, but more importantly, it may be making ourselves vulnerable to demonstrate trust, to show them that we then are in an exclusive relationship because we give them this kind of power. Only they are the person who deserves all of this sort of stuff. So see, maybe, does it all work together? Is it all a kind of package? And is that what happens? Relationships. If you were to think about using this as a part of your essay, what I would say then is to take one of the theories, pick one, explain it as fully and accurately as you can, apply it to the circumstances of your life, tell me that you know how the theory informs the events of your life, and then finally end up with a 3 or 4 so paragraph discussion of the role of alienation in all of this. In what sense does alienation become a part of relationship, particularly relationship dissolution, and among other things, control and blame placing and some of those elements, right? Now, some of you have only happy memories of all the relationships that you're ever in. And over the years, as I've read essays by other students such as you, I get this notion that my boyfriend, my girlfriend, my whatever it is, maybe even my dog and I, we really like one another. We're just little lovebirds and all this. This is wonderful. We have never done any of the things that lead to, oh, that's wonderful, that's good. Now come back 22 years later and let's see what the story is like. Because life is this evolution through narrative over time, isn't it? Will it always be that way? Will it change? Etc., etc. Well, relationships. On Thursday, we will turn our attention to social cognition. We'll ask the question, how do we really get to know other people? And to what extent do we want to know who they are? And does meeting and getting to know someone create certain amounts of uncertainty? Is uncertainty uncomfortable? Do we seek information to get to know who the individual is, whether the individual likes us, and therefore whether we should continue to like the other individual, which is a way of looking at the connection between chapter 6 and chapter 7. So there we go. Any questions? We'll see you then. Yeah. That's okay.